this encounter with this guy named Matthew, whose Jewish name is Levi, by the way. We know that from Mark chapter 2. His nickname was Levi, not the source of the genes, but yeah, they usually had like a Greek name and a Jewish name. And it's written about 16 AD. The theme that stands out is Kingdom of God. And as we mentioned, there's a certain focus, right? There's a certain focus, certain emphasis for each one of the Gospels. The setting here is probably, it's written in Palestine. And in your notes, you can see here the key verses. Okay? Of course, Matthew was written after Jesus had resurrected, way after, okay? And so from the resurrection, roughly about 20 years had passed. And so somebody thought, okay, we got to compile something on Jesus. And so in light of persecution that was happening during this time, Jewish Christians were starting to get persecuted. And so Matthew wanted to strengthen their faith. And so he came up with a good news story, which is a gospel of Matthew. This is the first gospel that we find among the four. Speaking of first, there are I believe there are first-time APLA students, okay? If there are first-time APLA students, maybe you can go ahead and stand up. If this is your first time to enroll in APLA. Anybody? All right, okay, let's give them a hand. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for making the time to be here. Thank you for enrolling. Okay, so Matthew is the first gospel. In your notes, there is an outline. And we said that the emphasis is for Jewish audience, right? The Jewish audience. And the presentation of Jesus here in Matthew is a kingly person. So over and over, you have the picture of a king coming to his people. So our outline is aligned to that. The first part is birth and preparation of the king. Sermon on the Mount is about the ethics of the king, like how to be in the kingdom, right? Rejection of the king, clash with leaders, etc. So Jesus is presented as a king. In fact, you could look at the whole book of Matthew as what it means to have a relationship with the king. Okay? Now, highlights. There's a lot of quotes from the Old Testament, over 50 times. Because, as we said, what is the target audience, the main target audience of Matthew? Jewish, all right? A Jewish audience. Let's go ahead and read together Matthew 1, verse 1 through 6. Matthew 1, verse 1 through 6.
Anyone? This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife.
Thank you. And it goes on, all right? Now, I know when some of you guys read salmon, you got hungry for lunch, okay? All right. But what is the point? What is the point here? The beginning of Matthew is a bunch of names that would have resonated with whom? A Jewish audience. Okay? The Greeks do not know these guys. But a Jew especially those who had been listening to the stories from the past. They knew about Abraham, they knew about David. This would have resonated with them. Again, this points to the target audience of Matthew. And what is Matthew doing? He's doing a bridge. He's coming up with a bridge from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It is saying the story continues from the time of our forefathers. And so Matthew is a wonderful, logical bridge between the Old and New Covenant, between Jewish believers and Gentile believers, because it's saying the things that are transpiring now excuse me, are a fulfillment of things that were planned long ago. Not only that, we said that there is a kingdom coming. Jesus is presented as a coming king. Let's check out Matthew chapter 3. This is something I would definitely underline in my Bible. Matthew 3 verse 1 to verse 3, please. Matthew chapter 3 verse 1 to 3.
In those days, John the Baptist came, preaching in the wilderness of Judea, and saying, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. This is he who was spoken of through the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one calling in the wilderness, Prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him.
You see how that passage does two things. One, it does help with the bridge, right? The bridge between the Old and the New Covenant. And number two, it presents this theme of Jesus as a coming king. Over and over again, Matthew is saying this kingdom is breaking in. And so we need to respond and receive it. Check out Matthew 4 verse 17. Another verse I would underline. Go ahead.
From that time on, Jesus began to preach, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near.
Okay, again, there is a kingdom that's breaking in. There is a king who demands a response, and that's why you should repent. All right? So, interestingly, 60% of Matthew's verses contain the spoken word of Jesus. There's a king who's coming, he has something to say, and you better respond to him. Another thing that you'll notice about the book of Matthew is the discourses. The discourses. There's a lot of talk, a lot of speeches mentioned in Matthew. And Matthew is so organized into 5 sections. So Jesus has these speeches. The Sermon on the Mount is one of those speeches. But there are 5 discourses or speeches. And Matthew formats his material around these 5. So, Jesus is walking around, he gives a speech, and so what do we need to think about or respond to from this speech? Jesus walks again, he gives another long speech. What do we need to think about, reflect on from the speech? 5 times in Matthew. So keep that in mind when you're reading Matthew at home. In fact, he has these markers when Jesus had ended. The Jewishness of Matthew is also seen by the titles. Son of David, Son of Abraham, King of the Jews. And at home, I would recommend that you read these chapters to help you see, one, again, the focus of, or the theme of Jesus as King, and second, how this kingdom is breaking in as fulfilled from the Old Testament. All right, so that would be it for Gospel of Matthew. It's the most read Gospel anyway, so we won't take more time with Matthew, but those are the highlights. Next, let's turn to Mark. Mark is the shortest and simplest Gospel, written about 60 AD, and it also carries a certain Jewishness to it, a certain Semitic flavor. All right? Just like, with Matthew, there's a Jewishness to it. This one, the sambal. You can still taste the sambal. All right, there. Okay, the flavor, right, for the Jews. However, even if it's the flavor still comes out, and by the way, some books and websites will mention that most probably this gospel was originally written in Aramaic, okay, and later translated into Greek, okay. You've seen the Passion movie, right? Passion movie, okay. You know there are Aramaic. There's an English subtitle or a Chinese subtitle, but there are Aramaic parts spoken there. All right, so that's Aramaic, okay. Aramaic itself had different versions or variations to it, but yes, many scholars will say that Mark was originally in Aramaic, and that's why the undertone is very Jewish, okay? But it was later translated in Greek, and then it was spread out throughout the Roman Empire. And if Jesus is portrayed in Matthew like a king, here in Mark, he is portrayed as a servant. Not very kingly. Not very kingly. And if Matthew was written primarily for a Jewish audience, the appeal of Mark is to a Roman audience. Mark uses Latin. He inserts Latin terms. He uses things that would appeal to Romans, certain words, certain expressions, even though he doesn't write in Latin, but the gospel is in Greek. For example, with time, right? With time, Mark describes time according to the Roman system. And then when it comes to Jewish customs, it's almost like Mark has to explain Jewish customs to people. Okay? So Matthew assumes that the one reading Matthew knows David and knows Abraham. Mark doesn't do that. He explains certain things to people. Oh, this is what it means. This is the translation, just so you know. Because again, he's thinking of a Roman audience. He doesn't have genealogies. Not what you'll find in Matthew. All right? And again, that's because he has a different audience in mind. Okay, some things you can check out at home. All right? The Mark that we're talking about is most probably John Mark. Check out the reference. I think it's here. Did I write it here? Yes, Acts 12:12. John, whose nickname is Mark. Most of us here, we have nicknames, right? Okay? So I have a nickname. Most people call me Roland, but some of my best friends call me Bodge. Okay, Bodge. Especially when they want to borrow money, all right? So they start calling me Bodge, all right? But anyway, all right, so, so John Mark is called Mark, so maybe his nickname was JM, all right? So, and he's associated with Peter, okay? He's associated with Peter, no time to explain, but you can pick that up from the book of Acts. So the theory is that they were associates in ministry, and Mark was not an eyewitness. Okay, he was not an eyewitness to the things that are happening in the Gospels, but because he's close to Peter, Peter would dictate certain stories about Jesus, and then Mark would write it down. Okay, so that's one of the theories. Okay? Okay, and you have what it says here. Justin Martyr was one of those who believed that it comes from Peter's memory. So Mark is his Roman name, John is his Jewish name. Okay? And he was a close companion of the Apostle Peter, who passed on the details of his association with Jesus to John Mark. Okay. Now, here's something interesting. If that is true, okay, that Mark was collaborating with Peter, then you have to think about the things that Peter decided to include in the story, and the things that Peter decided not to include in the story. Because of the Jewishness of Mark and the strong evidence that indeed Peter's hand was involved in this, it's interesting that the walking on the water of Peter is not included. Also, remember how Peter, they had a D group. They had a D group in the foothills of Caesarea Philippi, right? And you say, hey, who do you say I am? And you said, and Peter would say, you're the Christ, right? And then Jesus said, man, good job, son of Jonah, yeah? And Peter said, yeah, that's me. I scored in this D group, right? So that high point where Peter was lifted up, it's also not in Mark. And then also, how Jesus had a special errand for Peter, getting of the temple tax. That's also not in the Gospel of Mark. And so, it's interesting to know that if Peter didn't really have a hand in this, then this highlights, the book of Mark highlights Peter's modesty, because he did include the things that would lift up himself. And I find that interesting about Peter, right? That he was motivated to write about Jesus, but he didn't want to include things that might get the focus off Jesus and to him. And I think that's a good tip for us as Christians. That as we live our lives, I think we'll have many opportunities to lift up ourselves as disciples. But if indeed Peter had a hand in this, then we can imitate Peter's humility. That Jesus would become greater and we could become less. In fact, that's how Peter was, right? That he would have it no other way. That I would rather that Jesus is highlighted and not me. I want to challenge those who are in leadership today. Do we do things to highlight ourselves? Or do we actively downplay ourselves? So that Jesus is highlighted and not us. I think about our parenting. In our parenting, do we tend to highlight our control, our values, our priorities, our principles, which is not bad in itself. But in our parenting, do we highlight Jesus more than us? That our children will be more loyal to Jesus than to us. That our children will be more indebted to Jesus than to us. Good preaching point here from the history of the Gospel of Mark. Now, if Jesus is presented as a servant, then look at the outline of Mark. The outline of Mark is really about servanthood. The first 10 chapters of Mark are about serving, the presentation of the servant, opposition to the servant, instruction of the servant, and the second one part is sacrifice, rejection of the servant, resurrection of the servant. I think the outline itself is very instructive. If Jesus could have presented himself only as a king, Mark presents him as serving and serving and serving and serving even more. I think the Gospel of Mark is very good for old Christians. Because for old Christians, sometimes we get tired of serving. Especially after some time. Right? It gets tiring too. And sometimes we need rest. But just last week, I was sitting with a guy who's he's an old Christian. And he was kind of struggling. We spoke for 4 hours. All right? Not my usual appointment. But we spoke for 4 hours. He said, bro, I just have to be honest with you. Sometimes I think of all the ways that I've served. And I can't help but think that maybe I've given enough. Maybe now it's time for me to receive. Maybe it's now time for me to take back. It was good. He was just open about it. And he even said, bro, I was so tempted to calculate all the contributions I've given to the church. All the special missions contribution. I said, what kind of car I could have bought. That's an SUV with all my different contributions to the church, you know? And you're laughing about my appreciate his openness. Old Christians, have we gotten tired of serving? 16 chapters of serving for Jesus, never tires of serving. I think it should just inspire us. We've never really given enough, right? Yeah. Jesus was the ultimate example of giving and serving and rendering all the best of himself to people, and finally giving the ultimate sacrifice. I really want to encourage the old Christians, no matter how much you've given or served, your labor is not in vain. And you have served for the King. Your labor is not in vain. It doesn't go unnoticed. And you will receive a reward in heaven. But the outline of Mark should inspire us as old Christians to never tire of serving, because serving itself is a great reward. Now, for those of you who have in the 90s, you know, like me who lived in the 90s, there's this thing called Reader's Digest, okay? Reader's Digest is an abridgment of things, short articles that are, interesting and pithy. That's how Mark is. It's a short gospel, and it's very fast-paced. Now, in most versions of Mark, in English, it will have the word immediately. Did you notice that with Mark, right? So it will have immediately, right away. I don't know if this word appears in the Mandarin versions, but right away. So Jesus says or does something immediately, right? Immediately, right? So it's a fast-paced movie, all right? That's how it is, okay? Anybody here like action movies? Yeah. All right? Mark is for you, okay? Not much drama here, guys. All right? Not a lot of talk and crying. It's all action, all right? Which, by the way, would appeal to the Romans. The Romans were not emotional like the Greeks. They like action, you know? Let's just kill everyone and be done with it. You know, that's the Roman military, you know? That's how it was. So those of us who like fast-paced action movies, yeah, Mark is for you. The key word is key passage is 10:45. This is something I would definitely underline. And everything revolves around Jesus as a servant. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Mark is structured like that. Jesus serving, and serving even more. And interestingly also, Mark focuses on the passion. Mark focuses on the passion. The Passion Week, look at that, takes up about a third of the gospel. So everything is building up to the last third of the book, which is Jesus' sacrifice and death. Okay? So, the Passion Week and the focus on it is obvious. Now, let's turn our Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And can we read together Mark 6, verse 4 to 6?
Mark 6:46. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Sorry.
Mark 6, verse 46.
Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." He could not do any miracles then, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at the lack of faith.
Okay, why would I underline this? These are reflection points. Okay? Here's an example of a reflection point from Mark. So, if you decide to read Mark in your quiet times, take note of these reflection points. So, like I said, it's like an action movie, right? You know what's the series? The Bourne Identity series? right? You get tired, right? Like everything's so, and you'll find yourself catching your breath because of, you know, how Jason Bourne, right? It's so fast-paced, right? So Mark is like that, very quick, but then he stops for comments. So that's what I like about the Gospel of Mark. Action, action, action. And you, oh man, wow, man, he must be so tired. I'm tired just reading the Gospel of Mark, right? But then he slows down for comments, such as this one. You know, he's commenting on the lack of faith in Jesus' hometown. So, it makes you think, why could Jesus not do many miracles in his own hometown? It says here, faithlessness. Okay? So that's what I like about Mark. It's not just about event. Take note, make sure you catch these in your quiet time. In between these events, Mark gives short commentaries. Now, like I said, there is still some Jewishness because Mark inserts some prophecies like the one in Isaiah. And so there's still some Jewishness there about how it continues from the Old Testament. There are terms used also that are very important, like baptism of repentance, leaven of the Pharisees, get behind me, Satan. There are terms used that, one, they speak to the Jewishness, right? The Jewishness still of Mark. Okay, and two, they also serve as they help out with those reflection points. Okay, all right. I want to show you a picture here. Yeah, picture here. Remember, there's a demon-possessed man from Mark chapter 5, right? And then this demon-possessed man. That whole story of Legion, right? And how he the lead. Maybe we should have a skit on that. Any volunteers to do that skit? Anyway, so at the end of that story in 520, the man decides to go to the Decapolis. There's a good amount of archaeology done in Decapolis, and here you find it's been pretty big. You know, the 10 cities are pretty big. So you can go ahead and Google that, see pictures of the Decapolis, which should really inspire us. Here's a demon-possessed guy, and he decides to take his evangelism higher by going to 10 cities. You know, so that's pretty inspiring for me. Okay, moving on. Let's go to Luke. Luke happens to be my favorite gospel. Luke is the longest gospel. It's written AD 60 to 62. And Luke was a very talented guy because he's most probably not just an evangelist and author, but he was Luke MD. All right? So from Colossians 4, we could tell he's a Gentile physician, but he was also an excellent writer. And it's interesting here that God used both Jews and non-Jews to write the New Testament. And a whole chunk of the New Testament is written by a Gentile. Right? A non-Jew, and that's Luke. Very comprehensive, very accurate, and wonderful writing in Greek. Many scholars will agree that Luke writes with some of the best Greek in the New Testament. You know how, like, well, okay, let's talk about the universal language, English, right? If English is the universal language now, there's English that's like, you know, street English. I don't know if that's the best term, right? There's street English, and then there's somewhat educated English, right? And then there's whoa English, like, you know, very highly educated English. I think you could say the same for many languages, right? There's colloquial Chinese, and then there's high-level Chinese, right? So that's what Luke does. He's operating on the highest level of Greek. Okay? And you could say, wow, this guy was highly educated. Now, another thing that's interesting with Luke is, let's go back to Mark. Let's check out Mark chapter 5. I want to show you something interesting here. Now, this is the story of the bleeding woman. Okay? The bleeding woman. And go ahead, bro. Can you read Mark 5, verse 26?
Mark 5, verse 26. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse.
Okay, so she was suffering for a long time, okay? And so she had used up her savings. She was always at the ATM paying the doctors, okay? She withdrew her savings, she spent all this money, but she never got better even after consulting the doctors, okay? This story is also in Luke, okay? This story is also in Luke, but there is nothing negative about doctors. Interesting, huh? There's no negative talk about the doctors. Okay, so so most probably, the doctor did not put those. Okay, so Luke decided, I'm not gonna incriminate myself here. Okay, now, but if you compare Luke and Mark, there are medical terms in Luke. All right? So there are terminologies that are used about medicine, cures, diseases that are specialized terms, right? And you can say someone really educated. One book mentions at least 300 technical terms in Luke and Acts. And these terms, only someone highly educated or a doctor would use those terms, all right? So anyway, some interesting things about Luke. Okay, let's read the intro to the Gospel of Luke. Let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 1, verse 1 to 4.
Luke 1, verse 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
All right. You'll see this introduction also in the book of Acts, but he gives a little bit of a background, right? There are different historical accounts, and I wanted to make sure that you understand, or you have a bigger, better understanding of what you've been taught. Now, pictures of Jesus. Pop quiz. The picture of Jesus in Matthew is a coming king. Picture of Jesus in Mark is a suffering servant. Picture here in Luke is the ideal man. Okay? So, Jesus alone fulfills the Greek ideal of human perfection. And this is why the appeal of Luke is very universal. Okay? Universal appeal, not just for Jews, not just for Gentiles. Luke's gospel is written from a Gentile mind to a Gentile audience, but here it's a very universal appeal. In fact, you see this all over Luke. He is inserting different words, phrases, or stories that will appeal to different audiences. The other thing about Luke is that it's very different than Mark because Luke is very deliberate, regularly paced, not many surprises, right? Not many surprises like the Gospel of Mark. And I think that's also very instructive for us today. I think most probably God used the kind of personality that Luke had to write this exact gospel. I guess that God used the personality of Peter. You know how Peter was, right? He was very impulsive. And maybe John Mark was the same. But Mark is, very action-paced, very impulsive. Luke is very structured, not many surprises. And so we have this variety in the Bible, which I really like. How many of us here are sort of the Luke type people? You like structure, you like order, right? And you don't like many surprises. How many of us are like that? All right? Okay. How many of us are more the adventurous, spur of the moment kind? You're the Mark type. Yeah. All right. Those are the Mark types. You wanna ask them to buy you lunch, right? Hey, why not? It's an adventure. Life is an adventure for you. Right? Okay. So I like that because it's a reminder for us that God uses all types of personalities in the kingdom.
That's right.
All right? Whether you're a Luke type or a Mark type, God uses both. And sometimes we tend to gravitate to people with the same personality as us, or we have certain biases against those who have a different personality than us. I want to encourage you, just looking at the Gospels reminds us God uses all types of Christians with all types of backgrounds. Let's not look down on others with a different background than us, with different tendencies than us, with different personalities than us. Because that is the beauty of Christianity. God uses different people from all walks of life. All right. Now, there are two volumes. Two volumes for Luke. So he has the Gospel volume and the Acts volume, which we'll look at. But it's very structured, and he's a great historian. Key verses, check out Luke 1, Luke 15, and Luke 19:10. No time to go over those, but check those out at home. Now, who was Theophilus? Who was Theophilus? Different theories about him. One theory is that he was a government official. There's a term in the passage which we just read. He's called most excellent in Luke 1 verse 3. He uses the same title for officials like Felix and Festus. So that's one theory. Maybe Theophilus was a government official. The other theory is that he was a patron. Back then, if you were going to do some writing, not everyone wrote because it was expensive to write. You would have to buy papyrus, papyrus ink, papyrus pens, and if you were not well versed in or conversant in writing, then you would have to dictate to a scribe. So anyway, all this writing was an expensive enterprise, and you needed money. So maybe Theophilus was someone who was paying for the expenses. The other thing that's interesting is that Theophilus is a compound name. The word theos means, we know that already, God, right? And phileo is the verb for to love, to befriend, okay? And so Theophilus would mean God loved or lover of God. So maybe it's a code name for people who love God. Or it could be all of the above. Or a combination of one of those two. So, different theories about who Theophilus is. Next, let's look at the outline of Luke. The outline of Luke, as we said, highlights him being a perfect man. And the picture is he is Son of Man. And so our outline follows so. He's introduced, chapters 1 to 4. He begins his ministry, develops his ministry. The next chapter is 4 to 9. He is rejected, chapter 9, verse 51 to 19. And then finally, he's sacrificed, he's crucified, and then he resurrects. Now, there is one verse that I think it's good for us to look at because it's a turning point in the Gospel of Luke. And not many scholars notice this. Let's look at Luke chapter 9 and verse 51. Luke chapter 9 and verse 51.
Luke 9:51.
Go ahead.
As the time approached for him to be taken to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem.
Okay, what do we find here? Well, why is this verse important? For the longest time, the ministry of Jesus, because we looked at geography, right? We looked at geography earlier. Okay, pop quiz. What's the area up north? Galilee. What's the area down south? Judea. And then there is Samaria. Samaria. Okay, right. Because we're good Apple students, we've mastered the geography already. Okay? So, for the 5 chapters, Luke 4 to Luke 9, the ministry is mostly situated in the north. Luke 9:51 is a turning point in the Gospel of Luke because it says there, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, meaning his ministry focuses on the south. So there's a downward movement from his northern ministry now to a southern ministry. I just wanted to show that because it shows you, one, the importance of geography. Two, it shows you the shift. From Jesus being the ideal Son of Man, now he's shifting towards, well, that ideal man is going to be rejected, right? And it's sad because the answer to the Greek question is of who's the ideal person, who's the one that we're supposed to emulate, right? The perfect person is going to be rejected. And so that would resonate with the Greeks. What's ideal has been rejected, right? So anyway, that's the turning point in the Gospel of Luke. Okay, highlights. In the Gospel of Luke, which we said has a very universal appeal, Luke cares for those whom others seldom think about. For example, women. I'm sorry, sisters, but in the first century, you were second-class citizens. Okay? I'm so glad that's not the case now, at least in most countries. But back then, women were considered property. Okay? And so, yes, if you were married back then, your spouse was your property. And you know what? Sad to say, it's still the case in many places in the Middle East. So you would introduce a woman whom you espouse, not as your wife, but hey, not Mrs., but this is my property, not Mrs. Okay? Sad to say. Luke changes that. It's almost, it's really countercultural. In his day, women were looked down on, but Luke challenges the culture. And I think that's a great reminder for us as disciples. We are meant to be countercultural. We're meant to be different from society. If we blend too much of society, take care. Maybe you're not living out Christianity. If we become like the world too much, we gotta be aware. So here's an example. Let's look at Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3. Let's look at some highlights here from Luke and look at his countercultural appeal. Right?
Luke 8, 1 to 3.
Mhm.
After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were happy to support them out of their own means.
All right, thank you. I love this passage. I love this passage, okay? If you do a little background research, most Jewish teachers did not have women followers, okay? And even Greek teachers, because of the culture, they looked down on women. It was not a big thing to have a women follower. They could care less if they had women followers. Luke highlights the fact that he had women followers. Some of them had positions of authority. And I like what's said there in verse 3. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Oh, by the way, Luke 8 verse 3 is a good verse for ministry contribution. Right? Because even before you had the church, the idea was if you have a ministry, those who benefit from the ministry should contribute for the upkeep of that ministry. So this is one of my favorite, verses. I know Christians, we love 2 Corinthians 8 a lot, right? We use Philippians 4 a lot. But for contributing to the needs of the ministry and ministry offering, I love Luke 8 verse 3. Okay? And women are involved. A vital component of Jesus' ministry was women. Amen, sisters. All right? You guys are important. So, going back to the point here about Luke, the ones who were ostracized, the ones who were relegated, not important, were highlighted by Luke. Not just women, but even immoral women. Samaritans were highlighted. Lepers, tax collectors, and even criminals. So I like this about Luke. The ones who were outcasts of society, Luke found something good about them. I think that's a great attitude to have, brothers and sisters. Right? So I think some of us, we might have become critical of Christians already. Like, let me ask you, when you see a disciple, is it easier for you to notice the good or the bad? Sometimes, and this is my fault too, there are times I've pigeonholed Christians. Like I put them in categories, right? And sometimes in my mind, I've labeled them. But you know what? I love how Luke gives a fresh perspective on people. And Luke always sees the good in people. And I think that's something great for us, right? Again, it's also countercultural. The things that are common in culture, Luke goes against the grain, which is a good challenge for us Christians. Are you becoming too much like the world? I remember giving a whole, maybe half of my lesson was devoted to social media, all right? And social media is today, it's just the in thing, right? How many of us are on Facebook or Instagram? Okay? Yeah, you're on, yeah. Now, nothing against it. It's very helpful in many, many ways. But I've had Christians come up to me and confess, bro, sometimes when I look at Facebook or I check out my account, I struggle with envy. Because Facebook, what's happened? Facebook has become a brag book, right? So Facebook has become like all the nice things, that's what you post, right? And so there was a sister, she was confessing, when I look at Facebook, I struggle with envy because it's almost like, we have a new car. We travel to this place. I upgrade my cell phone to the Samsung, like whatever, it's got the top, the top of the line or whatever, and some people struggle with it, okay? And I think there's a good call for us. We're not supposed to be like the world. Okay? We're not supposed to be like the world. We're supposed to use social networking for spiritual purposes more than worldly purposes. So let me ask you, the stuff you post or the stuff you like, is it more the spiritual stuff? Right? The stuff that engages you on the internet, is it more spiritual stuff or is it more worldly stuff? Again, we just got to be careful about the things that are all around us. Okay? And Christians are meant to be counter-cultural. So anyway, I've had some Christians who've had Facebook fast. Okay? Meaning they just stop looking at their Facebook. They decide, okay, this month I'm not going to look at Facebook. All right? Just so I can wash my mind from the worldly influences. Okay? And I know of some Christians, I think I shared this story before, right? Some Christians, because they're starting to struggle, right? Because it was all like, I was able to finally buy this, or my brother was able to get this, or reach out this, and she goes, unfriend, I'm not gonna respond to this, unfriend, Man, that was just a personal. No one told her to do it. She decided to do it because I want to focus on spiritual things. Anyway, what's the whole point? The whole point is that the Gospel of Luke, even if it has universal appeal, is countercultural. It's a great reminder for us Christians. We use the things of this world, we engage the people of the world, but if we're going to let our light shine, we're meant to be countercultural. We operate at a higher level, all right? Because we're loyal to Jesus. Okay, some things you can note. Chapter 17 highlights Samaritans, okay, who were looked down upon. And Luke 24, you can also read Luke 24, because Luke 24 highlights women, all right? Women. And remember who were the proponents of the resurrection? The first who found out about it were women. Okay, and that's very interesting. If you remember the story as well, right? Women went to the tomb, correct? They went to the tomb, Mary, right, and some others, and they checked out the tomb. It was empty. So what did they do? What did the women do? They reported to the guys. Okay? So Mary got on Instagram and posted, right? Hey, the tomb is empty. Okay? But anyway, they did not believe the women. In my Bible, Luke 24:11 says, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Okay? Now, I hope the sisters don't feel too bad about that, but that's how the brothers were. All right, their words seem nonsense. I remember discipling a married brother on this. Hey, bro, you gotta listen to your wife more. I think you are too biblical. What do you mean too biblical? When your wife talks to you, you consider her words as nonsense. So, don't be too biblical, bro. You're taking literally Luke 24:11. You gotta listen to your wife more. When she talks, she's smarter than you, and you know what? It's not nonsense. But anyway. Alright, so anyway. This is one thing I totally love about I totally love this about Luke. So, sometimes, right, because women were looked upon in society. So Luke elevates their faith sometimes higher than the men. Okay? The Gentiles, the Jews, they were all arrogant, right? Because they're the chosen race. Luke gets the Gentiles and elevates their faith higher than the Jews. The lepers, Luke elevates their gratitude more than the normal people, And that's what I love about the Gospel of Luke. In a way, Luke is kind of like rebellious, right? Because he's rebelling against society. And I don't know who of us are kind of, you grew up kind of rebellious, like you go against the grain, yeah, Luke is for you. Alright? The Gospel of Luke is good for you. Okay, other things. Luke has 4 songs. Okay? Luke has 4 songs. There is what's known as the Magnificat. Okay? So Mary, the mother of Christ, okay, she finds out she's pregnant. And what does she do? She does karaoke. Alright? Karaoke. Alright? She sings a song. Okay? And this song has been transformed into many songs and operas. Okay? And some of you might have heard it. You know, it goes something like, my soul sings, da-da-da. Don't worry, I won't sing, all right? That's it, okay? So that's a song, okay? Benedictus is also a song. Now, we know Gloria, right? Christmas Carol. I said I was not going to sing, but anyway. All right, so that's the Christmas Carol, Gloria, in Chelsea's, okay, Luke Diminis. So there are 4 beautiful hymns in Luke. Okay. Now, other things to take note of. We said Luke is a very universal, okay? A very universal gospel. That's what we like about Luke. Okay, something I would highlight is Luke 2, verse 10. Let's check out Luke 2, verse 10.
Luke 2, verse 10. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people.
All right, see that? I would underline that. Universality of the Gospel of Luke. It's for all people. Another verse I would underline, Luke 19, verse 9 and 10. You remember Zacchaeus? Okay? Zacchaeus, is he a Jew or Gentile? He's a Gentile, and what was his work? Tax collector. So the Jews hated him because he's a Gentile, and the Jews hated him all the more because he collects taxes. Okay? So this was not a guy who's well loved. Aside from that, what kind of tax collector was he? Chief tax collector. Alright? Alright. Personally, I like Zacchaeus because he's a short guy. Yeah! Hooray for the short people! Okay, anyway. Now, so, he's a Gentile, but look at what happens here. Jesus says something ultra controversial. Luke 19, verse 9 and 10. Go ahead, Rob.
Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Okay,
do you see how controversial this would be? Okay, so I would underline this, maybe encircle Abraham. Can you imagine how the Jews felt? I mean, this is Jerusalem, right? And he's talking to Zacchaeus, who's not only a Gentile, he's a tax collector. And he's not just a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector, the hated among the hated, right? And he says, you know what? My guy, Zacchaeus, he's also a son of Abraham. Can you imagine the Jews reacting? They go, what? No, not that guy. But if I could be farther from, that Gentile, I mean, they would probably just throw in dirt. No, I'm gonna unfriend him from my Facebook, whatever. These guys hated Gentiles. They hated tax collectors. But Jesus says something controversial. He's a Jew now like you, right? Super controversial. He's a son of Abraham. So, and then he says, the Son of Man, a title, right? That's a title we find in the prophets. He made that title universal, okay? It was used in Ezekiel, remember? Son of Man. But now he's using that title as a universal title because he's insisting the gospel is not just for the Jews. the chosen race is not just for the people of Abraham. The bloodline, the spiritual bloodline, is not just for Jews who are part of the line of David and Abraham, but now the blessing is for those outside of Israel, even for non-Jews. Okay? So again, universality of Luke's gospel. Note also, we don't have time to read it, but if in Matthew the genealogy goes back to Abraham, look at the genealogy of Luke. It goes all the way back to Adam. Okay? So, universal appeal. Then you have unique elements in Luke that are found in 9:51 to 18. All right. Jesus shows a lot of compassion for the hurting and the lost. His arms, you can imagine, Jesus' arms are open for all people, and he keeps in touch with them, never giving up on people. Jesus shows a deep interest in people. He loves people. He meets their needs. He's not interested in status, race, or gender. And likewise, we need to have the heart that is shown here in this gospel, right? The same kind of interest, appeal, and concern, regardless of how long it takes to touch people. One of the guys I reached out to a long time ago, his name is Dennis Guda. And he moved to Sydney along with his family, and they're now elders in the Sydney Church of Christ in Australia. But one of the sad things that happened in Dennis' life was that his mom was baptized before, but left the church. We kept on praying for him and his family, but just last year, really happy that after 17 years of being away from the church, Dennis's mom got restored. It's just a great thought to think about, that we should never give up on people, no matter how long. And many of you know my parents, right? Many of you prayed for my parents. I'm really thankful for that. But I think about that as well. Waiting 27 years, for my parents to study the Bible and get baptized. I think it's just a great reminder, which I think is so much in line with the heart of Luke, right? That we just need to keep on believing in people. We just need to keep on loving people, extending our hands to people, because we never know how or when they will respond. Maybe we have people who studied the Bible before, but have stopped. Let's keep the friendship with them. Maybe we have loved ones or some of our friends who left the church. Let's keep the lines open for them, right? Let's remember their birthday. Let's remember their anniversary. Let's remember them when they're sick. Let's greet them on special occasions. Let's visit their house or their workplace. Let's not stop extending our hand, because that's what Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke. He never stops extending that hand of love and compassion, because somehow, some way, God will move in their lives and they'll respond. Amen? Okay, this is a good time to end for lunch. Okay? Are we going to have lunch or just eat the Bible? All right, consensus is for lunch. So how about a, what is it? 10, 12.